Have we started?
Yeah, we're just waiting for, I think the attendees are coming on slowly.
Okay.
So we'll just give it exactly 30 seconds and then we'll go ahead. Good evening, everyone. My name is Orgho Sengupta, and thank you very much for joining me today for a very special Vidhi book Adda. This one's on the Emergency Chronicles by Gyan Prakash. Those of you who've read the book will know how rich this account is, not only of the real life incidents that took place during the emergency. It starts with a quite wonderful chapter on Prabir Purakaistha, who was a doctoral student at JNU at the time. He's of course been a panelist at several Vidhi events in the past, and how he was picked up without reason on a fateful morning in 1975 during the emergency, and how stories like Prabir's play out over the course of these 2 years. But not only is this an insight into real life accounts, but it also makes a deeper academic point about the fault lines in Indian politics that caused it. And I think this is, in some senses, a really remarkable central thesis, that the emergency wasn't really an aberration, as of we would like to believe, but it was the culmination of a conservative constitution, power-hungry politicians and officers, a supine Supreme Court, as well as media, all of which have deep structural roots in India. 1975 didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the political circumstances in which we were in post-independent India. And I'm delighted today to be joined by the author of the book, Professor Gyan Prakash, who's a professor of history at Princeton University. Thank you very much, Gyan, for joining us today. And I'm equally delighted to have Justice Jasti Chelameshwar, one of the finest judges of the Supreme Court of India, an outspoken voice in terms of reforms that the courts need, someone who will be a discussant for this book. Justice Chelameshwar, you may not be able to see on your screens now. His flight was a little bit late, so he's still trying to make it home, but he will be on in the next 20 minutes or so, and we will be able to hear from him during the discussion. To members of the audience who are here, both on Zoom as well as on Facebook and YouTube, thank you very much for joining us. For whenever you have questions, please do type it in the chat box, and I'm going to try and take as many questions as possible so that we can be as interactive as possible. And we hope to be done in about an hour's time, so we have plenty of time to get this discussion going. So Gyan, I'm going to start with you, and perhaps we're going to take a step back from the emergency to the Constitution itself. The Constitution of India has been celebrated quite widely, both in India and the West, and not without reason. But scholars generally, perhaps also carrying on this spirit of celebration, have described the Constitution in glowing terms, the Constitution-making process as India's founding moment. The Supreme Court itself, time and again, has called the document a transformative document. You've painted a far more sober picture of the constitutional text, according to my reading of it. And you've said that this is a constitution which has a heavy dose of centralization and believes that the new post-colonial state will really be both the protector as well as the harbinger of personal liberty. Do you think that you're sailing a bit against the wind when you've made this point?
Thank you, Arghya, firstly, for organizing this and for leading this discussion. And I'm very thankful, and I'm looking forward to Justice Chelameshwar joining us. I'd like to hear actually what he has to say. And thank you all for joining this webinar. So to start with your question, when I first started writing this book, and so, I'm not a scholar of legal history. And so the first thing I did was I delved into all the literature on Indian Constitution and, legal historians. And one thing I was struck by was, well, as you said, how much the Indian Constitution was lauded by historians as a unique achievement, certainly among post-colonial states, no other state had, you know, drafted such a document as a beacon of liberty, freedom, and so on. Um, and I thought that, they were missing a central point. And the central point was, yes, on the one hand, if you read the Constitution, you cannot but be impressed by the, I don't know, erudition of the lawmakers of that time, how aware they were of constitutions around the world, how deep the discussions were. Yes, I grant them all that. But to treat the document only as a document of intellectual history misses the point. And the point is that these people were forming a state, that the Constitution was an instrument of framing a new state. And in doing that, there were two contexts that were very important. One was the colonial legacy, and particularly the Government of India Act of 1935, which Indian Constitution imported about 80% of it, including all its kind of a centralizing bits and police powers, executive powers, and so on. And so there was already built into the Constitution this kind of a colonial centralizing aspect. And you ask, so why did they do that? Well, they did that because they were very aware of the kind of historic nature of their task. And they were forming a new state coming out of colonialism. And so they were very aware that the state must have certain powers. And so they imported that. The second context, I think, was very important, is that the time at which the Constituent Assembly was meeting, they regarded it as almost a kind of a Hobbesian state of nature. Even the members of the Constituent Assembly had to take curfew passes because of partition violence in Delhi at that time to even enter the hall for discussion. So there was this sense that the country was breaking apart. There was Hindu-Muslim violence on. There was a question of Kashmir later on, Northeast, Nagaland. And so the leaders were very aware that they were forming the state in a context of violence and separation. And so the state had to be powerful. It had to have power. And given that, it makes sense that from their point of view, the state had all the powers that, mostly that the colonial state had. And at the same time, it was also a document of freedom. So they were playing both sides. On the one side, India had become independent, and therefore all citizens must have equal rights and so on. And at the same time, the state must be powerful. Also because the state would be an instrument of social change. And so for all those reasons, the state as it, or the Constitution as it was framed, had this kind of a centralizing elements, which I thought historians had kind of missed in their celebration of the founding leaders. And, here one has to mention both, in admiration, but also in critique, Granville Austin's book, which became a kind of a founding book for constitutional historians, which, spoke about an oligarchy of, Indian leaders who, framed the Constitution. So yes, I was kind of running against the wind in making this interpretation, but I thought that was very important to understand.
I would say that yes, you might be running against the wind currently, but perhaps also leading a new charge, because some of the work that several younger scholars, including me, we're trying to do is to say that that this was a conception of a powerful state, and it was centralized both in economic terms as well as in political terms in the amount of power it has, including in chapters like fundamental rights, which were extremely hedged with a lot of restrictions. So even something that is the beacon of liberty. But one of the key reasons why this keeps coming out in the Constituent Assembly that they did it is that they felt that now power was in Indian hands, that state power would be in Indian hands, and so it would not be exercised in the same way that it was in colonial hands. And of course, Gandhi had foreseen this situation, and he had said that all you're doing in Hind Swaraj, actually, when he had said that all you're doing is essentially making it an English state, and it's the same kind of powers, but just with brown people and not white. Uh,
Mhm.
how the emergency, I think, is obviously the culmination of perhaps uh, the 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 weakness or the optimism of that thinking, which really didn't come to pass, because politicians were, when vested with political power, obviously work in a certain way, and they're not, just because they're not colonial or British, doesn't mean that they exercise their powers any differently. So how do you see this linkage between this kind of large centralizing state with a lot of power over citizens' lives, and what happened during the emergency when that power ran amok? How does that linkage play out?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, it raises the question of the relationship between structure and contingency. So just because you have a centralizing structure doesn't mean that it will automatically lead to a certain trajectory of, the emergency. So something has to happen. And in a way, people like Ambedkar, even as they were framing this centralizing constitution, they were also aware of it. I mean, it's not as if they did it in a fit of absent-mindedness. They were aware that there were these centralizing aspects. And that is why the Indian constitution is the longest, because the idea was to, have all these kind of provisions and clauses and take care of various kinds of contingencies. If this happened, then that will happen, and so on. But the leaders in 1947 had a certain kind of a vision about Indian politics. And they had, you could say, a kind of a naive belief that even though we are handing all this power to the state, the political leadership will be wise enough to use it prudently and will not kind of run with it. So it's the kind of interaction between this structure, which already had these centralizing elements, and the way politics plays out, that we get to something like the emergency. So through the 1950s and so on, I mean, the example of the Preventive Detention Act, for example, is a good example that, they are responding in like 1950, they are responding to the threat that they see of a communist insurgency. And therefore, they formulate this law. And interestingly, it was to be only for a year unless it's renewed. Okay. And of course, it's renewed several times. So they are responding to the situation and using the provision that the Constitution already gives it. So politics, as it plays out, then interacts with the structure in order to put into practice the constitutional provisions that it already had to erect this kind of, authoritarian structure. So the way Indian politics plays out in the 50s and the 60s, and you begin to get, from this sort of rosy vision of Indian politics to, the rough and tumble of, power. And that's the interaction that produces something like the emergency.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the key points that your book makes, which is that it's really not just about Indira and Sanjay coming out of the ether and taking this power in a way that no one could ever have envisaged. There were certain structural conditions and developments over the course of the last 20 years which allowed them to do so. So, if we were to dive right into the book, could you tell the audience a little bit more, perhaps, in terms of how, and perhaps with some more egregious instances than others, Indira and Sanjay could exploit these structural characteristics that were there both in the Indian constitution as well as sort of politics over the last 20 years that really facilitated the emergency.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to begin with, there was the emergency provision itself, which was, of course, hotly debated during the Constituent Assembly. And I remember in the Constituent Assembly, several members, cautioned and raised the question of, and raised the example of Article 48 in the Weimar Constitution.
I think H.V. Kamath does that on a number of occasions.
Yeah. And he said, remember, this has been used before and it can be used again. So, and it is then used. So,
but also, sorry, just to interrupt you there, but it also seems that at that point of time, as in though there were voices like Kamath, they were really in the minority. But because there was a large majority of voices, a lot of them lawyers, actually, and very fine lawyers, who said we need provisions of this nature. And so just because of power can be abused is not a reason to grant power. So I think that
including Ambedkar.
I mean, Ambedkar was the greatest votary of this provision.
Ambedkar's example is kind of interesting because, we know him from his role as a great voice of kind of Dalits. Okay? But Ambedkar is also, skeptical of mass politics. And he says that now that we have the Constitution, we don't need the grammar of anarchy, as the term he uses, that Satyagraha produces. That so long as we were under colonial rule, Satyagraha was fine. But now that we have the Constitution, there's no need for it. And so you can see that with his skepticism of mass politics, and I can understand also why he has that skepticism, because he also has deep skepticism about Indian society and that how Indian society is so hierarchical. And so he doesn't see that Indian society from its kind of resources will produce a kind of a mass movement that would be for equality and against caste discrimination and so on. And so he's depending on the state. And so it makes sense from his point of view to make the defense of the emergency provision. I think it's Article 356 or something, right?
That's right. 356 is the provision which allows you to impose president's rule on states, and also 352, which allows you to suspend everything in case of war or external aggression.
Yeah. So he thinks that no state is worth its while if it doesn't have these provisions to protect it. So, and that is why there was a large majority of support in the Constituent Assembly. Although, as you noted, yes, there were minority voices against it, but the large majority was for the emergency provision. And so when Siddharth Shankar Rai comes up with this sort of idea of using the emergency provision, it's not out of thin air. This is what is kind of interesting about that moment, and perhaps it's very different from the present moment, is that there is still a drive to what I call um, lawful suspension of the law, that we would impose. So she imposes an emergency to save her political power, but does it formally, lawfully. Okay. And that's the kind of a paradox over there, that you use the law in order to suspend the law. Uh, so that's an example of how the existing provision in the Constitution could be used and was abused uh, in order to impose an authoritarian rule.
That's right. And so take us to 1975. Siddharth Shankar Ray is giving a suggestion to Mrs. Gandhi. Mrs. Gandhi, of course, has had this reversal from the Allahabad High Court, which has invalidated her election. At that point of time, it seems obviously that there are multiple options on the table, including an appeal to the Supreme Court, which she did, and she got a stay or a partial stay on the Allahabad High Court order. What happens in that time that pushes India over the precipice, so as to
Mhm.
say? And your book has a lot of detail over how that was kind of building up. So
Yeah.
just take us to that moment and what kind of caused it in your view.
Yeah, it's a moment where you're reading through the materials. It seems as if after she got the partial stay, um, she might kind of stay with it and follow the kind of a legal route, but she doesn't. And she doesn't because I think the pressure is building within her kind of a circle of advisors, by which time Sanjay Gandhi and Bansi Lal and people like that have now risen into prominence. And uh, by this time, P.N. Haksar has been kind of shunted. Um, uh, Dhar also has been shunted. And so now the center of gravity of power is shifting towards this kind of a new power circle around Sanjay, which kind of pushes her. And she she's also aware that it's a strange thing that she had done. In a way, she had destroyed the Congress as a party and had become her very instrument. And in any such situation, the person in power is also aware that she could be toppled because the structure is so narrow. So she had also, a fear that, for example, there was this idea that Jagjeevan Ram could, uh, take over temporarily until her case is sorted out. But what if Jagjeevan Ram decided that, he wouldn't resign? Um, and so she is faced with all these kind of choices. And so then she chooses, pushed also by her kind of advisors, uh, to take the emergency route. And uh, but again, she thinks that there is a kind of a legal cover that emergency Article 356 gives her. Um, and and that's what she does. So it's a moment where, on the one hand, uh, there's a kind of a legal pressure from the process, and there is her own insecurity about her own party. And of course, the third is JP and the JP movement, and the uh, rally in the Ramlila Maidan, where JP almost sort of calls for the police and the army to disobey orders. And that proves to be the kind of a clinching factor for her, that everything is gathering around her. Things are happening in Bangladesh, Mujibur Rahman. And so, I mean, she sees this. I mean, in her in her mind, and of course we'll know this if the Gandhi
Her
family
papers are,
decides
yeah.
to release her paper, and if she wrote or anything about it. But in her kind of a mind, things are closing in, and the only option now is to impose the emergency.
That's right. And I think that's actually a good segue to talking about what happened in the emergency, which I think is for me, as in was the part of the book that was most insightful. Uh, you've talked about you talked about Ramlila Maidan and JP's protest march there. Old Delhi seemed to be the kind of hub for a lot of activity during the emergency. And of course, when we think of the emergency, we think of Turkman Gate, uh, the bulldozers in Turkman Gate. Of course, there are eerie parallels with what is happening in Jahangirpuri, but as you said, there are very many differences. The most important being that that was under a kind of so-called legal cover. There is no so-called legal cover now, but still it seems to be happening. That's a kind of different question. But what happens during the emergency, as you pointed out in your book, is that Sanjay Gandhi really runs amok, and and through Sanjay Gandhi, as in his coterie, Bansi Lal, and the lesser actors like Bhinder and the lieutenant governor and the secretary, the bureaucrats under the lieutenant governor, all tend to run amok. And during that time, and you've spoken about detentions that have taken place at that time without reason for long periods of time. You've spoken about bulldozers and sort of slum clearances, and also about forced sterilizations. When you were reading those papers around that time, what is it that struck you as perhaps the most egregious violations of law that this so-called emergency allowed perpetrators to get away with?
Mhm. In when I was reading the Shah Commission report, there was a particular term that really struck me, and that term was politicization of the bureaucracy and bureaucratization of politics. Uh, and these two things happen at the same time. Uh, Now, it's not, again, it's not an aberration. And that's why, I go kind of great lengths in the book to talk about the kind of a prehistory of the sterilization campaign uh, and Sanjay's Maruti venture, because I see both of those as kind of emblematic of a certain process that was already in operation. So it's not that Sanjay Gandhi suddenly came up with the sterilization idea. Uh, there was this whole population movement and so on that had been in operation since the 50s, and picks up steam in the 60s, precisely when they are unable to reach their goals. And there is a kind of thinking that maybe we'll need some coercive measures, and many coercive laws were in fact passed even before the emergency. So Sanjay comes in the wake of all of this. So uh, my thinking was that uh, what Sanjay and his coterie do is to ratchet it up by a few notches, a process that was already in operation. So it's not that he invents it, uh, but now he takes it to a different level. And as I was reading those accounts, I mean, often because of the kind of historiography of emergency, of course, sterilization had received a lot of attention. But in historiography, what happened to people in everyday life? Um, like, for example, after sterilization, when Jagmohan sets up all of these colonies, for resettlement, what things people actually went through. Um, some of it is known in academic books. but it's not kind of widely known, but it was experienced. And so, I mean, I found those accounts of kind of an experience of everyday emergency to be really very kind of poignant. Yes, there is, it's a more abstract level. You can think of, curbing of freedom of speech and censorship, the arrest of, leaders and so on. But some of these accounts, I found one particular account of this engineering student from Kerala, Rajan, to be really heartrending. And the way in his sort of father goes, runs pillar to post in order to just even find his body. So, there were all these kind of accounts of how, so what happens? That it's not just, people often think, oh, it's politics, I'm not interested in politics. It actually has real life effect on the life of people. And so you better pay attention to, what's going on.
Absolutely, and I think that's where I urge everyone who hasn't read the book to pick up a copy of the book, because of course there is a popular understanding, and I remember when I was 5 and I asked someone about the emergency for the first time, what I first got told is that the trains always ran on time in those 2 years, and that seems to be a popular myth
Yeah.
around that time, and that could be in some sense part of this legend that was created around the emergency through the propaganda and censorship at that time. But once you peel off those layers, as in these sort of really poignant human stories come out. And I'm delighted that Justice Chelameshwar has joined us. As he said that he'll be here in 30 seconds, and I can see him. So and I can see him now. So thank you very much, Justice Chelameshwar, for joining us. And
sorry, extremely sorry. It took me 1 hour from the airport. There's a huge traffic, and everything got delayed today. The flight
no
got
problem.
delayed. The peak hour traffic, I got stuck up. Sorry. Anyway,
This is still in good time, and I think this is a good segue, Justice Chelameshwar, to have you before we get to questions around the Supreme Court and around the emergency, particularly ADM Jabalpur. What Gyan was talking about was of ordinary human stories during the time of the emergency, and this climate of fear that had been created. You graduated from Andhra University during the emergency in 1976. You became a lawyer during the emergency at perhaps the most interesting time to be a lawyer, when the law itself was suspended. Before I ask you the more sort of conceptual questions around the Supreme Court, let me get to your story during the time of the emergency. So what was it like in Visakhapatnam in 1976? Did you feel it, or is there part of this kind of myth which got Indira Gandhi elected from the south as well, from Chikmagalur, that the emergency was much more prevalent in the north and not as much in the south? What was your experience like in that time?
See, when the emergency was proclaimed, I was doing my final year of the law course. It was then the university was actually shut down for the summer vacation at that point of time. A week or 10 days thereafter, exact dates I don't remember, maybe first week of July or so, we went back to the university. There was some kind of a very eerie silence prevailing in the campus. Of course, the basic information by then, a lot of these leaders of the opposition parties have been detained. The information was available to each one of us. Some amount of panic was certainly there, because first of all, the general panic among the public, plus panic among the younger minds, because we were facing something like this for the first time in our lives. Then it so happened, a couple of weeks thereafter, I think 5 or 6 exactly, I have to count now, 5 or 6 of my own class fellows were detained under Misa. My immediate neighbor in the hostel, who was my class fellow, unfortunately passed away very recently, a few months ago, 3-4 months back, he passed away. And 4-5 others from my own class were picked up, apart from many other people from the university campus, from various departments. Now, it created a kind of panic among the student community. People were worried, people were angry, people were concerned. All kinds of reactions were there. But then it didn't stop there. In fact, as a personal anecdote, I can tell you, I was so disturbed. Not that I really understood the implications of the emergency or what was going to come in the future, next 20 months or whatever it is. But the very fact few of my colleagues were, my own class fellows were taken in a MISA itself created a lot of disturbance. I went to my constitutional teacher, Professor Gopal Krishna Shastri, who had actually by then retired a few months prior to the proclamation of emergency. A great teacher, of course. I went to him and expressed my gloom. An experienced old man, a very mature person, used to speak very slowly. He said, "Man, don't worry so much. A lot of things happen in this world. I had seen Hitler," he said. More or less rhyming with that biblical saying, even this shall pass, kind of. But then the panic was real. And then a few months thereafter, on some occasion, there was some program in the university for which Mr. Sanjay Gandhi was invited those days. Some students, some bold souls tried to make a protest organized on that occasion. And I was a witness to it, how mercilessly they were beaten up by the police on that occasion. All these things suddenly sent panic. Now, not only that, the kind of, intrusion into the lives of people. The intelligence people used to regularly visit. One day, one officer walked into my room in the hostel. There were a few books lying in my room apart from the law books. One of those books, I don't remember exactly the title, something about Marx, Karl Marx. It was lying on my table. That man came in. Of course, initially, he was very civil. Of course, he said, "Where do you come from?" What? He was trying to check up my background, so on and so forth. Very gentle otherwise. Then after a few minutes of this familiarization, he said, "Why are you reading this book? The book which is dealing with Marx." I said, "What is wrong with this book?" No, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but why are you reading this? Then I asked him, I've always been a little, me, by now I think the whole country knows. So I said, "Why are you not asking about other book? There's another book lying on my table written by Radhakrishnan. Why are you not asking that question? Why am I reading that book? If reading that book is good, you're reading it's a question of academic interest. I'm reading." Then he smiled and left me. But then even this was happening. Just to give you a taste of what was going on.
No, I think this is a real insight that police officers were coming into hostel rooms and asking what books students are reading. And I think that kind of makes it live, particularly for people like me who didn't live through that emergency, as in to actually understand what it was. And there, particularly as a law student, as in, of course, there would be, and history now sees it in this way, that the emergency was actively facilitated, if not at least implicitly endorsed by the Supreme Court. And Jan talks about it in his book as well, when we were discussing some of it before you joined.
Followed.
Yes, I know you were there. So in the famous or infamous ADM Jabalpur case, as the Supreme Court reads the emergency provision very narrowly and very literally, and says that that this is lawful, that the suspension of the right to move the Supreme Court is lawful, and that in the famous words of Justice Chandrachud and also then Justice Beg, that they have a diamond bright, diamond hard hope that the executive will be maternal to the citizens. And I think this was a sentiment that was echoed by Chief Justice Ray, Justice Chandrachud, Justice Peg, all of
there
us.
is a background to that. There is a background to that.
Yes.
So the proclamation of emergency, the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, went on. She went to address the nation on those days. TVs were not available all over the country. Delhi, of course, had, but rest of the country didn't have TVs, only radio. It was telecast, broadcast, her speech. She specifically chose that, like a mother administering a bitter pill to a sick child. I had to do this. I mean, it may not be the exact language, but sum and substance, these two phrases were used: mother and a bitter pill. So obviously, everybody was willing to swallow.
So I think that's why the. So I think that bitter pill was followed, including by the Supreme Court. And so there's my question to you is that, of course, we see ADM Jabalpur as a historic mistake. But we know that the Supreme Court also in its first 20 years, and this is the thesis that Gyan has, is that the roots are deeper. The Supreme Court has been a conservative institution for the first 20 years, particularly when it came to personal liberty issues. So do you think ADM Jabalpur is a bolt from the blue, an exception that we should forget and see that, okay, everything is past? Or do you think that there were some deeper causes which made ADM Jabalpur happen?
No, today, when I'm 69 today, all of you know my background, that I've been a lawyer, judge of the Supreme Court, so on and so forth. I don't see there's anything which should be perceived as a bolt from the blue. It was inbuilt in the whole system for two reasons. Philosophically, the Supreme Court was right. An assessment whether an emergency existed, once the document, the text of the Constitution provides for the imposition of emergency, and an assessment whether the conditions which call for the imposition of emergency exist or not is a matter, even I would personally believe it's for the executive to make it. And the judiciary would be the least competent body to make an assessment in this regard. Now, whether the power was exercised bona fide or mala fide, that was the only question that remained. Well, it depends on how you look at the institution. Whether the judiciary, well, each one of the issues arising under the Constitution, are they justiciable? A major issue. So forget about the emergency which followed Mrs. Gandhi's debacle in the Allahabad High Court. There was an emergency proclaimed on the basis of a war. In fact, there was an existing emergency in force at that point of time. An emergency declared because of the 1971 war with the Pakistan. Now, if an emergency were to be declared in a situation like that, would the judiciary be the competent body to decide whether it's really necessary or not? I mean, in my view, it's not. It's certainly not, because the executive has all the inputs about it, and then it should be left to the elected body. If they take a wrong decision, we have to only say that we chose the wrong people. No, I don't think 9 or 27 or 32 unelected judges can go into this matter. They certainly don't. I mean, I'm not on the question of the elected or unelected. They certainly don't have the necessary inputs. One thing. Now, in the context of internal emergency like this, well, emotionally, yes, it's very disturbing because Mrs. Gandhi invoked it because of her debacle in the election case. But for that, suppose for some other reason, such an internal emergency clause was invoked, would the court be justified? On principle, we have to examine this matter. No, I was one person who was greatly disturbed and greatly opposed the emergency those days in my own little way. That's a different matter. But looking at philosophy, the point is, politically speaking, the invocation, the thing is obvious. She was invoking only because of the debacle. And when everybody failed, the cabinet meekly surrendered. The President of India simply signed it. And you don't expect the Supreme Court to, at least the Supreme Court in theory also perhaps is incapable of taking a decision going into that. Of course, the later development of S.R. Bommai and the doctrine proponent. Without meaning any disrespect to anybody, I would like to see such a pronouncement once again in the near future, when any ruling party has a substantial majority in the parliament, whether such a pronouncement would once again come from the Supreme Court, I have my own doubts.
That's right. So you're actually saying that there are obviously deeper political factors at play as to when the Supreme Court can be bold and forthright and when it can't. And I think that's sort of the kind of myth that we need to bust, that the Supreme Court, as in determines questions of law in a vacuum. They obviously determine it in a very clear political atmosphere.
Every question, can the Supreme Court decide every question? Which has now, remember the doctrine of the political thicket. Some of these questions are so intrinsically interwoven with the political problems. And there are some of the areas where perhaps the courts may not really have the authority.
That's right. So, but Gyan, I want you to come in on that, because you've talked about in great detail, particularly about this additional district magistrate Pradipto Ghosh, who does both things, that is put Prabir Purakaisa in prison and also solemnize his marriage. So it's a very interesting character that you've spoken of. But if we look...
Before, I may add one thing, I might be misunderstood. Yes. Add one statement. This is something different from saying the law declared by the Supreme Court in ADM Jabalpur that the fundamental rights are a grant of the Constitution and dehouse the Constitution. There are no fundamental rights. The people have nothing else to say. The moment they are suspended, like any other, that is a questionable proposition.
That's right. That's right. So I think we can...
To live, I don't think is a grant of, at least in a democratic society in 20th century, it would be absurd to believe that it's a mercy of somebody else. It's a gratitude.
Absolutely. I think that's something fun. I think this is the point that you're...
That perhaps is a greatly objectionable statement of ADM Jabalpur that, of course, now the Supreme Court substitutes.
And not just a statement, I think the philosophical premise of that judgment, that life and liberty are a bounty of the state. And I think that's what you're saying, that obviously the judgment is wrong on that, but whether and how far the court can go into whether the emergency was necessary or not is a difficult matter.
Is a different matter.
Absolutely. But now to Gyan, I'm on the question of what happened. Now, with Pradipto Ghosh, you've shown as to how he was made to sign these detention orders. And the question that arose before the court also was in relation to whether the court itself can look into the legality of those detention orders. We are now no longer talking about whether the emergency was necessary or not. Let's grant the court that there is no basis for the court to decide whether this is bona fide or mala fide. Assuming but not conceding that. But on the detention order itself, you've shown how retrofitted these reasons were and that these reasons really didn't exist. So do you think that the Supreme Court judges upheld their oath of fulfilling their oath under the Constitution to do justice without fear or favor? Or do you think that in terms of refusing to get into detention orders in the way in which 9 high courts had, was in some sense a dereliction of their duty? Yeah.
Well, I'm in like tricky waters over there. I mean, I think, as Justice Chalmeshwar was suggesting earlier, that, there are certain areas where politics and the law are completely interwoven, which is different from the other point that he was making, that whether the judiciary has the capacity to make the judgment about whether the emergency itself is justified. I mean, I agree that, in our desire to get certain results, we cannot just say, oh, judiciary should do this. Because once you concede them this right, what's to stop them from legislating from the bench on a variety of other issues? So, but on this particular question of detention, I mean, I do think that the Supreme Court dropped the ball on these particular detention cases. So, for example, when Prabir Purukaisa's case was kind of folded into all the kind of habeas corpus cases, and then we know what happens to ADM Jabalpur and so on. I mean, he was basically denied his day in the court. So on particular issues, I mean, I think this is where the relationship between politics and judiciary sort of matters. That if there is this kind of atmosphere of fear, that affects the judges as well. And so they will rule in a certain way. Here, it's not so much a question of the constitutionality of the emergency itself, but it's the actually implementation of various kinds of laws. And that's where you can see, I mean, I don't want to jump into the present, but you can see how patently that is at work today. When High Court judges can say in the Umar Khalid case that his speech is obnoxious. I mean, what is that? That's where you can see how politics is patently affecting the judge's opinion. So today's case must be kind of, I offer that as an egregious example. In the emergency time, similar kind of a process is playing out when people are being denied by the Supreme Court, unlike the High Court, their day in the court.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is a kind of debate in itself as to whether what we are seeing now as it is a reprise of the past. As I've written about this, that it's certainly not. It's very different from what it was during the emergency for a variety of ways. And I think that the role of law is very different in the sense that the law itself was the cover during the emergency for a lot of the actions, whereas the law here seems currently as in is kind of in a parallel universe to what's happening with our politics. And I think that's a much deeper question. We have plenty of questions that are already coming in from the audience, and to members of the audience who are here, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. But Gyan, I'll start with one question to you, and then I'll take one to Justice Chelameshwar. A member of the audience asks as to how you see India's experience with the emergency vis-a-vis the experience of Pakistan with martial law, both under Ayub Khan and Ziaul Haq. If there is a difference, is the difference and India's subsequent return to the democratic path primarily down to the Indian Army's distance from the civilian government, or do you think there are other factors at play?
Well, I mean, in a way, there is both kind of similarity and difference, because the crisis of 1975 happens across the subcontinent. It happens in Bangladesh, it happens in Pakistan, it happens in Sri Lanka. Everywhere you get, I mean, Bhutto, before he is arrested and executed by Zia, he was also moving towards an authoritarian system when his regime was in crisis. So, I mean, I see this as part of a much larger process that's happening. It's not just unique to India. But the difference is that India, because of however imperfect Indian democracy had been, but it had by 1975, nearly 2 decades of a kind of a democratic experience. So it was very difficult to put genie back in the bottle as it was, for example, in Pakistan, where they didn't have a similar kind of an experience. So, and you can see that even in the imposition of the emergency itself, the care that Mrs. Gandhi took, however disingenuous it was, to dress her regime in law was different from what Zia does that in 1977 onwards. So I think that that democratic experience plays a part in both the way emergency is imposed and what happens after the emergency.
Right. And so, Justice Chalameshwar, I'll take the other question to you, because this is a kind of response to what we were discussing earlier on this overriding idea of centralization of power. Now, the question is to do with centralization of the state, but I'm going to just take it a little bit wider, that the Constitution itself, as in we as lawyers tend to perhaps politely call it quasi-federal, but the Constitution itself has heavily unitary features, and a lot of it had to do with fears of secession at the time, given the immediate history of Pakistan's formation. The Constitution has this kind of greatly centralizing features. One. Number two, the emergency, of course, was the epitome of this kind of centralization. This belief that if you can coalesce power in almost one person, then that's the way India will proceed. But we see this kind of move towards centralization coming out of New Delhi quite a lot. And even recently, when Amit Shah said that, we want Hindi across the country, not in an imposition kind of way, but Hindi is needed in order to integrate the country into one. And that kind of is one other sort of basis for centralization. And we also see this in the Supreme Court, which kind of has over the course of the last 70 years taken over a lot of the powers. That earlier, the matters which used to end at High Court level now end up at the Supreme Court. Administratively, the Supreme Court is also kind of become superior, not just judicially superior to the high courts. All of which, in my view, are part of this thesis that centralization of power is the way forward for India. What is your view on this kind of sentiment?
In my opinion, this kind of centralization is not good for the country, not good for India, not good for any country which claims to be a democratic country. Now, decentralization of power may have certain disadvantages. So every system has its own advantages and disadvantages. But as we know this country, with all its diversity, you start centralizing everything, it may lead to a lot of other complications. And apart from the existing structure of the Constitution and the powers which enable the Parliament or the government of India to exercise authority in various areas, to the derogation of the state's powers. There are specific provisions under the Constitution. In certain circumstances, the Parliament can exercise the legislative authority over areas which are exclusively assigned to the state legislatures. Those provisions. There is nothing but part of this centralization process. Now, adding to that, of late, in the Supreme Court is contributing. For example, when the Supreme Court directed that there should be a uniform entrance examination system for medical colleges, it's adding one more step to the centralization business, because the educational standards and the standards of the accomplishment are not uniform throughout the country. Now, in such case, asking that there should be a uniform process for education, it may have 10 minutes and the Supreme Court considered this thing. But point is it really part of the Supreme Court's responsibility looking to make such pronouncement is a question which always troubled me. And more and more these kind of exercises are undertaken. The autonomy of the states gets diminished, which in turn over a period of time would cut at the very root of this idea of federalism in this country. As it is, the Supreme Court has been saying India is some kind of a cooperative federation, not like America. There is all that all of us are aware of it. But even from that cooperative federalism stage, if we are progressing a step further, what remains in the constitutional idea of federal structure is a question which troubles me greatly.
That's right. So,
can I just jump in over here?
Yes, yeah, yes.
Yeah. Just in referring to this question, the contrast between the constitutional structure in the US and India, I think is instructive over here. that when Trump was in power, because of the US federal system, when Trump tried, for example, the immigration ban, there was a possibility for the courts to intervene and the federal structure to intervene to actually, blunt its impact. Okay. I think India's kind of this unitary structure does not permit that. And so we find that, in the long run for democracy, for example, if you move towards this kind of a greater centralization under the excuse that it's necessary for national integration, it's necessary for national unity, etc., it will play along with the kind of unitary structure to provide for an even more authoritarian government. And so I think the constitutional structure there matters. And the fact that, Hannah Arendt made this sort of a distinction between the French system and the American system, where she said after the French Revolution, the French developed a system where the idea was that the state would be an instrument of social change, and therefore it must have all the power. Whereas in the American system, there was, after 1776, there was always a kind of suspicion that political power leads to corruption, and therefore it must be decentralized and federalized. And I think India sort of chose somewhere in between the two, and it's moving more towards the French system. And so if you have that constitutional structure and then you have a political imperative towards homogenization, whether it's Hindi or whether it's curbing of states' power, it would be a recipe for an authoritarian government.
So two questions, one to Justice Chalameshwar from the audience and one follow-up to Gyan. First to Justice Chalameshwar, there's a question from the audience that does the ghost of ADM Jabalpur still haunt the Indian judiciary? Of course, it was very ceremonially overruled recently in the Navtej Johar case. But do you think that the ghost of ADM Jabalpur still haunts the Indian judiciary?
I don't know how you describe it. Is the ghost of ADM Jabalpur or something else? Description is your choice. But the situation hasn't improved much in my view. With or without ADM Jabalpur, whether it's declared by the Supreme Court to be bad law, in fact, I was a member of the bench which made that declaration. That's another matter. But situation, I don't think it's something essentially to do with the democratic maturity of the institutions. And I don't know. As of today, we have really reached. Even the most democratically mature countries, aberrations take place. You remember that Bush versus Gore judgment. The amount of criticism that was on. No institution is absolutely free from this kind of allegation. But speaking for ourselves in this country, I think situation is not much different.
That's right. And I think that's actually quite worrying that it's almost been, and almost to the day, because the ADM Jabalpur judgment was the 28th of April. So it's now 46 years almost to the day that judgment was given. But it feels like, and I agree with you, that it feels like the situation isn't very different. And that the institution, while of course it has learned some lessons, I think has to mature far more over a period of time. But Gyan, on that question on centralization that we were talking about, and perhaps that India moving towards this French model rather than the American one, and I think the question that often gets asked is that in the political discourse there are no credible alternatives. Right? There are no credible alternatives because unlike, say, the US right at the beginning, as when you're talking about Jefferson on one side and and Adams on the other. The fact is that one of the major fault lines of American politics was the power of states vis-a-vis the federal government. This has never been a real fault line in Indian politics. Like, you don't have parties which are talking. I mean, maybe there are some murmurs here and there, but you don't really have parties which are talking about federal power, more power to states and not the center. I think every party, including regional parties, want to have a share of the pie in the center. And so, do you think that that may have something to do with it? That in India, and this was partly a question that was asked in the context of 1950 to 70, that there was no real credible alternative of political parties which wanted greater state power. And even today, and that's kind of paradoxical in my view, that you have a proliferation of regional parties. But these regional parties are not really in any kind of politically thought through manner saying that, we want more devolution, we want lesser powers in Delhi, you want more powers in state capitals. There's really no program of federalism per se. How would you respond to the fact that there is no credible alternative to this model of the unitary state as being the model for India's prosperity?
Well, I mean, I think the alternative, in a way, is already there. It may not take the form of a kind of a formal drive towards federalism, but if one thinks of India's experience of democracy since the 1950s, I mean, one thing that happened, particularly since the 1970s, is a kind of a greater democratization, if you will, in the sense, greater participation of the people in elections, democratic process, use of the law, and so on. And with that has come the proliferation of regional parties. So now these regional parties may not coalesce around the idea of federalism, but I think the political process presents you with an alternative of a kind of a coalition of various regional forces, which for their own particular reasons, very transactional reasons, may come together to form an alliance which provides for some kind of a federalism without federalism being its goal. I mean, I give you an example of the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra. I mean, I know my friends and, the previous work that I did on Bombay, they intensely disliked Shiv Sena for all the kind of reasons of nativism and so on. Okay. But when the Shiv Sena saw, and having been part of, a coalition with NDA or BJP earlier, when they saw that its own future is threatened by an alliance with this national party, they chose a coalition government. Now, that provides for, some kind of a protection of, let's say, Maharashtra's own autonomy or semi-autonomy or politics. But that's some kind of an example where, for very transactional reasons, you may get a political formation that provides for federalism without federalism being its kind of a central organizing goal.
That's
so
right.
I think you have to depend on the political process.
Yeah, I know. I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because this example, obviously, as you said, as in for transactional reasons, it was carried out, and obviously seems like an opportunistic coming together. But you're right, as in it's in these kinds of opportunistic coming togethers that perhaps as in a new model can emerge, because it's always struck me as to why federalism and the fact that we don't have enough powers of states is not a bigger issue politically. So Justice Chalmeshwar, since you joined a little later, so one last question from me to you, and this is something that I've personally wondered quite a bit and sort of implicitly spoken about in Gyan's book. which is the impact of the emergency on the South. The fact is that there is a general phenomenon and understanding, and I may be completely wrong here, that the emergency was far more deeply felt in the North. And coming from Bengal, as in this time of emergency is kind of seen as fused as part of the end of the program of curbing Naxalism in Calcutta. So it's kind of seen as part of that continuum. But there is a general perception that the emergency was less felt in the South, which is why even in the polls where Mrs. Gandhi was roundly defeated, the Congress won 150 odd seats. Most of them came from the South, including your state of Andhra Pradesh, where the Congress won most seats, if I remember right. And Indira Gandhi herself has lost the election, but then won an election in Chikmagalur and came back to power. So, what is your sense, given the fact that you were a law student becoming a lawyer at that time in Vizag? So, what is your sense in terms of the impact that the emergency had in the south of India? And we'll end with that.
Ultimately, the proof of the pudding is eating. If people in South India did not vote Congress party out in 1977, irrespective of my personal opinions and my personal feelings about emergency, the common man did not feel the brunt of it in South India. As you rightly put it, in Andhra Pradesh, the old Andhra Pradesh, combined Andhra Pradesh, now present Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, it had 42 seats in the Lok Sabha. 41 out of 42 were won by the Congress party in 77 election. So obviously people really didn't feel the pinch of it in Andhra Pradesh. Similarly, Karnataka. Now, even Tamil Nadu, for different reasons, from 1967, DMK was holding the sway and they got it. Congress couldn't make a dent there. It has nothing to do with emergency or otherwise. So DMK established its own electoral superiority there. But certainly it was, obviously people didn't feel it. My individual view of how bad or how good the emergency was is irrelevant in this matter.
No, so perhaps I think that's one of the major drivers for centralization is the fact that we are many nation states rolled into one with various implications of things as we move further and further away from Delhi. And I think that could be one of the main drivers for centralization that arises. Yeah.
One more aspect of centralization, in fact, this introduction of the transfer policy of the judges. When a big issue was raised during the emergency, within 16 judges were transferred all over the country. All the opposition parties said they are trying to muzzle the judiciary. And later, when the Congress party came back to power in 1980, they introduced this transfer policy. First of all, as a rule, chief justices are to go. And what federal principle do you justify this? I don't understand. The reasons sought to be given in the floor of the House, if you recollect the then Law Minister's statement. No, they are to be handled appropriately. It's transferring of a Chief Justice from one state to other, or making it a rule that no man shall become, or woman should become a Chief Justice of his own or her own state, would eventually hand over all the power to the Government of India, which incidentally, by a judicial interpretative process, the Supreme Court Collegium started sharing it. The net result is, now the federal principle insofar as judiciary is gone once for all. All of us know, at a given point of time, some high courts had 3 chief justices in various states. Some high courts produced 3 chief justices working simultaneously in different states. Some high courts had no representation at all as a chief justice. How do you interpret this in the context of federalism? And nobody is talking, no political party is willing to reverse that process.
Absolutely.
No
Absolutely.
And your reasons are very obvious.
That's right. And I think this is a nice way to round it off, that the emergency at the heart of it was about politics, and that politics is intrinsically intertwined with the law. And this is what Gyan Prakash's book so beautifully brings out through human stories, that this is not just about Indira and Sanjay, and this is not just about something that happened out of nowhere. There are deep political, social roots for what happened during the emergency. And as citizens, we must be always alert that something like this whether in this form or others, is something that large, powerful states, as the one that our constitution has created, can always bring forth. So, Gyan, thank you very much for writing this book. It's a really wonderful book, and I urge everybody here to pick it up. And thank you very much to Justice Chelameshwar for being a discussant despite the difficulties in his schedule. Thank you for making the time. Thank you to the audience as in for being with us. We've tried to take as many questions as possible. So I hope you've had a good interactive session. I've seen a lot of historians and bureaucrats in the audience from the names who are familiar. Thank you for joining. And I hope this has been an insightful discussion. And finally, thanks to Gyan for agreeing to do this book Adda with us early in the morning in Princeton. I'm quite envious of the weather that I see behind you, but sitting in 44 degrees in Delhi. But thank you very much for this early morning start and for this really.
My difficulties have not ended. My AC failed. The AC is not working.
I think next time we should all do this in person in Princeton.
Absolutely. Justice Chelameshwar, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, it's great to see you again.
I'm sorry I couldn't join in time because it was not in my hands.
No,
the flight delayed by 45 minutes.
Yeah. But thank you to everybody and have yourselves a good weekend. Good night.
Okay. Good.